Today on Pilot's Discretion, our guest is aviation medical examiner and pilot Brent Blue. He tells us about the top medical problems for pilots, how to manage the FAA paperwork process, and what it's like to fly a rare Canadian bushplane. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hi pilots, I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our complete archives. And remember, you can send us an email anytime at podcast@sporties.com. Today, I'm joined by Brent Blue, a name that many listeners will know from his regular column in AOPA Pilot magazine, but there's much more than just writer on his resume. Dr. Blue has been a senior aviation medical examiner for 4 decades and is board certified in family medicine and emergency medicine. He is also an ATP with more than 10,000 hours total time, including plenty of hours in fun airplanes like a Cessna 185 and the Norseman, which we'll talk about. Brent, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thank you, John. I'm glad to be here.
I want to ask you about pilot health, special issuance medicals, and a lot of other stuff, but let's start with a provocative question. Should the third-class medical itself be abolished? Do we even need this thing anymore?
I don't think so. The FAA probably does, but the point is that we've had the experience now almost 8 years of BasicMed with over 80,000 pilots, and there is no evidence whatsoever that there's any difference in the accident rate or fatality rate between third-class medicals and BasicMed medicals. And with that kind of data, I mean, that's a lot of data. 8 years, 80,000 pilots. It really makes you ask the question, well, what are we doing? And I think that's a very valid question. You know, when most of the FAA rules and criteria for granting pilot medicals were established, they were really done from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which is an ancient history in modern medicine. And the techniques of evaluating people, things like imaging studies, which were not available, CAT scans, that sort of thing, cardiac catheterizations. I mean, there's just a whole host of things that have gone on that make the aviation environment not as how would I say it? It's not as unique as it may have been back in the 50s and 60s when we really didn't understand near as much about aviation physiology or understand as much about how to evaluate a pilot for potential sudden incapacitation. And that's really what the aviation medical is all about, is sudden incapacitation.
You've written that FAA medical application, usually the first point where pilots plug into the system, is, quote, the most misunderstood form pilots must complete. So what is most misunderstood about that? What are pilots getting wrong on that application?
Well, there are a lot of things. I mean, it's not unusual for me to have somebody come in and say they've checked that they've got a heart condition, and I'd say, well, tell me about it. And they said, well, I had a heart attack. And I said, well, tell me about that. And they said, well, I had chest pain. I went to the emergency room, and they did all these tests and sent me home. Well, they didn't have a heart attack. What they had chest pain, and they had a full evaluation to make sure it wasn't a heart attack, and they sent them home. And the pilot did not really understand they didn't have a heart attack. They had what we would call non-cardiac chest pain that could have been caused from everything from indigestion to a bruise. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can cause non-cardiac chest pain. But you don't want to check that down, because if you were to say, gosh, I went to the ER, had a heart attack, that's going to raise all sorts of red flags, and it's going to cause a tremendous amount of paperwork for the pilot, because if the AME doesn't ask the right questions, that medical is going to get deferred, and then the pilot is into a morass of paperwork.
You mentioned that morass of paperwork, so let's talk about the process and special issuance medicals in particular. Lots of horror stories there, especially seems like that got worse during COVID. Has that process improved at all? Is it getting any faster with the FAA in terms of getting some of those medicals approved?
If anything, it's probably gotten worse. And this is, there are a variety of reasons. One is the process that the FAA has going on right now is broken. And that's well known throughout the system. Even I know for sure that the FAA Administrator Whitaker, who I happened to see yesterday at the MBAA meeting, has commented that the process is broken. In addition, there are not enough docs they are down on the number of doctors that are in the Oklahoma City evaluation office. And a lot of the problem is the FAA's own criteria. And that, I mean, there's a long story about that, but when you establish certain criteria and 50 years ago, and then you continue to use that criteria, nobody goes back and looks and says, well, do we really need to have pilots do that test? Or is there a better way of evaluating these things? Or how about what the local provider says or the local AME says? And so a lot of the delay is in the FAA's own making. Another problem is, of course, that if you submit data to the FAA, results of tests that they've asked for or whatever, and you go to the bottom of the pile, and after a certain period of time, when your application gets to the top and they realize, oh, we want you to have this other test, you get the other test, and then that goes to the bottom of the pile, and then you go through the system again. And so this really gets to be a little crazy. And one of the things that I have said over and over is the FAA does not trust local providers, and they don't trust AMEs. And, if you're going to have an AME system and you don't trust us, what's the point? And I can tell you that, and 4 decades of doing this and probably, 8,000 medical exams, I've never had a pilot who I've had to defer because of FAA regulations that I didn't think, who I thought that, should be granted their medical, who did not get their medical eventually. So they go through this entire process, and I'd say, well, gee, I told you that this guy was okay to fly, and here it is. He's, months or even years later, and many times several $1,000s of testing that insurance doesn't pay for, and they get certified anyways.
I've heard you suggest in the context of this, the concept of a temporary medical certificate. So maybe I can't get approved right away in the doctor's office, but I know I'm going to be going through FAA hell for 6 or 12 months. So tell us about this concept. Give us the pitch on a temporary medical.
Well, the point is that you get a letter from the FAA that says you have to submit a certain amount of testing or certain medical records or whatever within 60 days. And as Bruce Landsberg said when he was the assistant administrator of the NTSB, the FAA should have 60 days to respond. Well, they don't. They don't respond that quickly, and so a decent compromise would be, okay, let's allow the AMEs to issue a temporary medical certificate, and when all the paperwork is done, then the FAA can issue the final medical certificate. Don't forget, many pilots complain because they get their approval from the FAA 6 or 9 months down the line, and then their medical certificate is half over. I mean, it doesn't. The certificate doesn't start from the date of the FAA approval. It starts from the date of the exam. So if it's 9 months down the road, they've got only a year and 3 months if they're third class, and if they're first class, they may only have 3 months. So this is a significant issue. And by the way, it's only 3 months if they're under 40. If they're over 40, it may be expired and have to redo it right away.
How about mental health? That's been another hot topic. It's been mixed up in some of this, that more and more medicals are being deferred for mental health or medication issues there. It seems like the FAA aeromedical team understands at least that there's a problem. They've made some changes, or at least they've talked about them. Is that enough from your standpoint? Is there progress being made there, or is there more we need to do?
Well, there's been some progress. Since the Emerson event, that was the fellow who was on the Alaska Airlines flight that ended up getting diverted because he caused a commotion in the cockpit. He was a jump seater. That caused the NTSB to have a summit in December of 23 and exposed a lot of the problems that the FAA has. One of the big ones was that pilots are not reporting mental health issues, are not seeking mental health care because of the problems that they would have if they acknowledge that and set that information into the FAA. Then the FAA itself had an aviation rule committee called an ARC that with some experts in the field who made, I think it was 17 different suggestions to the FAA to change some things. And they did make some changes that went into effect in end of May of this year. One of the big ones is that a pilot could be getting a psychotherapy, meaning they were getting counseling. Whether it was marriage counseling or counseling for depression or whatever, then they could still have their medical. They wouldn't be denied on that basis. Now, they can't be on medication, and that's one of the problems because that's sort of an antiquated thing for the FAA to do, is to say, no, you can't be on medication unless you go through a pretty difficult and expensive procedure to get your medical. But at least they made that one step. They've also allowed the AMEs to make some decisions using a template on whether or not they can grant a medical on site. And that template is things like it says, has the pilot used an antidepressant in the previous 2 years? And if they have had it done or used an antidepressant in the previous 2 years, then they would have to go through the process of additional evaluation. If it's been longer than 2 years, then and there are other things that are okay, then the AME may be able to issue. However, the problem from my perspective is there's a yes/no column and on this template. And if anything is checked yes, then it has to be deferred. And one of the things the FAA is talking about is giving the AMEs more education, more training in order to evaluate these people. But the problem is that it doesn't allow me discretion to say yes, but. Because there are a lot of questions where, yes, the answer is yes, but there are extenuating circumstances that really make that question not valid or make it sort of irrelevant to the evaluation. So there's progress being made, but not as much as there needs to be. And quite honestly, I think the FAA is still pretty much in the 20th century as far as mental health. The other big issue, of course, is ADHD. And I think that, I call it the disease du jour. A kid doesn't do well in school, and all of a sudden his parents take him to some physician and say, we think he's got ADHD, he's not doing well in school. And he goes on medication for 3 months, and then nothing happens. He's not doing any better. And they take him off the medicine because it had no effect. Well, the problem is if that's reported to the FAA, that may require a deferral. And because then the pilot may end up, or the pilot applicant may have to prove a negative, which is always very difficult. Proving a negative is always difficult. So the other issue, of course, is that there's a lot more anxiety in the world today. And my personal kind of opinion on that is I think that children, particularly nowadays, are being raised without resilience. And that's because their parents tend to be helicopter parents and kind of solve all the problems for them. They get trophies for participation instead of for winning. And the world's not like that. And when kids grow up and get into the real world, dealing with these real world problems creates a lot more anxiety, and they're not prepared to do that. They have no resilience. They have no kind of coping mechanisms. And I think that's increasing amount of anxiety in the world. And so we see a lot more people with anxiety, both on and off medication.
Yeah, it's a catch-22 there, because I think in aviation, a lot of times, if you learn to fly, I know this was true for me as a teenager learning to fly, it makes you grow up real quick, makes you face those real-world problems, learn independence, learn confidence, learn problem-solving. But in this case, we've got some young people who can't get the medical to do that flight training to maybe learn some of those lessons.
Actually, I have parents call me to talk about their son or daughter's medical and the application process. And I've gotten to the point now where I say, listen, I do not talk to parents. I only talk to the pilot applicant. Because if that applicant can't talk to me about the issues and go through the process on their own, maybe they shouldn't be a pilot.
All right, so we've been talking a lot about the FAA process here, beating up on the FAA, which is always good fun. But I want to shift a little bit to pilots. This is something you've written about recently, of suggesting pilots take a look in the mirror a little bit. And you've written about how there's a difference between pass the medical and live a healthy life. So tell us how you think about, the spirit of a FAA pilot medical and what we need to be doing better as pilots?
Well, it's not just pilots, though, it's people in general, because, when it comes down to longevity, heredity is number one. You can't change that. Staying away from tobacco products is number two. That's a question we can't even ask on aviation medical. It's not asked if you use tobacco. But smoking and chewing tobacco, which we like to call spitting tobacco because that's what it is a single greatest risk to health after heredity. And then 3 and 4, from a longevity point of view, is keeping weight down and regular vigorous exercise. And there's no pill for regular vigorous exercise, and there's no pill to keep your weight down. It's really a lifestyle choice. And so for people who give you the example of type 2 diabetes. The single greatest cause of type 2 diabetes is being overweight. It's not like it's all of a sudden starting to occur all the time out of the blue. It's because people are overweight, and I think it's up to 60% of Americans now are considered obese. And if you want to live a long life and you want to fly a long time, there's some things you need to do, and exercise is number one, and weight loss or keeping your weight down is number two. And of course, especially for professional pilots who are in the cockpit all the time, it's really tough because they're sitting for their job, and they're at airports where airport food isn't exactly what I would call health food. And it's tough to get the exercise in, but it can be done. And a lot of pilots do it. And it's just a matter of figuring out ways and really scheduling in exercise and paying attention to a diet. The other thing I want to point out too about diet is, as we all get older, it's harder to do those, 2 4-hour legs or 3 4-hour legs in a day if we're doing a long cross country. And doing that without proper hydration, without eating real food is a big issue. And what I mean by real food is the candy bars and protein bars and junk like that is not real food. And so it's kind of like you might be able to get by with that when you're 25, but when you're 55, it may be more important to spend the night somewhere instead of doing 3 legs, or to really stop for lunch and have a proper meal instead of eating junk food so you can keep going.
Great advice. You mentioned the pill for weight loss and type 2 diabetes. So let's talk about some of the new weight loss medications like Ozempic. They've been in the news a lot, soaring use among the general population. Talk us through that as an aviation medical examiner. Are they approved? Are they smart to use? Are there any traps pilots should be thinking about?
Well, they're approved. You have to be on at a minimum, I believe it's 2 weeks if I recall right. You have to be on 2 weeks. You have to be stable on it for 2 weeks. Quite honestly, they're miracle drugs. And what they do for the most part, they do 2 things. One is they slow down digestion, which makes people feel full much quicker. But the big thing that they do is they decrease the pleasure center in the brain that food affects, particularly salt, carbohydrate, and oils. And those areas light up the same area in the brain that cocaine lights up. And so if you dull that area with this medication, the weight loss can be dramatic. And there is dramatic results from it. Actually, they're even using it now to get people off of addicting drugs as well. But a lot of people have lost a lot of weight on it. The caveat, though, there are some side effects. Constipation is a big one because that gut slows down, so there's a lot more constipation. There's a lot more burping and sometimes heartburn and nausea because the gut's not moving as fast. But the other big one is that if you go off the medication, after a while, that pleasure center starts working again. And if you haven't really adopted a lifestyle of not eating as much, you can gain the weight back. Now, it's not as bad as some of the fad diets or crash diets where you really gain it right back. But people are gaining the weight back when they stop the medications. They can go on a lower dose, and that makes it less expensive. And that's one of the biggest impediments to taking the medicine is it is expensive. But there are some generic type brands now that you can get that are generally a mixture with vitamin B and they don't come in that fancy pen administrator device that makes it more expensive. And that can lower the cost. But I can tell you that the number of people that have lost weight, get off hypertensive medicine, get off diabetic medicine is pretty dramatic.
Brent, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to ask you about pulse oximeters.
Great.
Ready to ace your flight training? With Sporty's pilot training courses, you get free lifetime updates, no extra fees, ever. New for 2025, we've added aviation-specific AI tools, Chat DPE for real-time exam prep, and Chat FAR to decode tricky aviation regulations. It's more than just test prep. It's smarter, faster learning. Get started today at sportys.com/learn-to-fly. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Brent Blue, who led the charge over 2 decades ago to get carbon monoxide detectors and pulse oximeters into the cockpits of GA airplanes. Brent, I would have to say you're successful there. I see lots and lots of pilots flying with these devices now, many more than there were 25 years ago. But for someone who thinks they don't need one, what would you tell them? If I just fly for $100 hamburgers and I think I don't need a CO detector or pulse oximeter, what would you tell that pilot?
Well, let me first talk about pulse oximeters. Pulse oximeters measure blood oxygen levels in a percentage basis, with normal being 95 to 100 at sea level. At 6,200 feet where I live, it's 90 to 95. The reason it's important is the FAA rules on oxygen were essentially established in the 50s before pulse oximeters existed. And they were based on some ideas on this is what happens with oxygen levels as you go up in altitude. And it was very inexact. And the proposal became a geographic proposal. So the 12-5-14 rule is based on geography. In other words, you can be over 12,500 feet for 30 minutes, but not over 14,000. And then if it's over 14,000, you have to be on oxygen. Okay, that rule's based on a lobbying effort from pilots when the rules were established, because if you can go over 12.5 and up to 14 for 30 minutes, you can travel anywhere in the continental United States, meaning you can go over mountain passes and so on in the West, and you can go anywhere. That has absolutely nothing to do with physiology. I mean, the 12-5-14 rule is ancient and should be abolished, but there's no lobby to abolish it. It's not going to happen unless there are a lot more other important things the FAA is dealing with besides that rule. The point about pulse oximeters are, and the rule that I basically came up with or the recommendation, and I think most people use, is you should take your pulse oximetry at your home airport. So if it's 97% at your home airport, then you should use oxygen if it drops 5 points below. So it goes down to 92, you should use oxygen. But if it goes 10 points below, it goes to 87, you must use oxygen. And the reason I said 5 points and 10 points as opposed to absolute numbers is that my normal pulse oximetry might be, because I live at 6,200 feet, might be 92%. So for me, if you make a hard number, say if it drops below 90, I could go up 1,000 feet and might be dropping that low. So that's the reason for those sort of technical issues. And by the way, the reason I could do better at altitude than, say, at 8,000 feet than somebody who lives at sea level is because my body has acclimatized to altitude, because I've lived here for more than 90 consecutive days, and that's how that happens. It has to do with the increase in red blood cells in your system. So most people, when they fly, and I can guarantee you that this is a very easy test. You go up at 8,000 feet and without oxygen at night, and just look around, and you'll see your panel, you'll see the lights of the city, and if you put on oxygen, you will see it what looks like somebody's turned a rheostat up on your panel and on the lights in the town, and that's because the retina is the most sensitive tissue to oxygen deprivation, and so it's a very instructive thing. But a lot of people need oxygen at 10,000 feet. They need oxygen at 8,000 feet. I mean, everybody is different. They might need oxygen because they've got a cold and they need more. And I can tell you for sure that if somebody's, even if they've just dropped down 5 points below their normal home oxygen level, using oxygen is going to make that trip less fatiguing, particularly if it's a 4-hour trip, and it's certainly going to make their landing better. And even if they only use oxygen for 15 minutes before they land, it'll make their landing better. So it's important. I think it's really important to use oxygen. It's cheap. And let me talk about cheapness or inexpensive oxygen. Oxygen is oxygen is oxygen is oxygen. And when they came up with aviators oxygen, the reason they did that was in the 50s and 60s, oxygen, different types of oxygen were humidified. Medical oxygen was humidified in the tank. So that meant there was vapor in the oxygen when it came out of the tank. And aviator oxygen, you couldn't do that because if there was vapor in the lines at high altitudes where it's very cold, that line could freeze because of that vapor. Well, all oxygen now comes from liquid oxygen sources. There is absolutely zero difference from aviators oxygen and medical oxygen, and even welding oxygen. In fact, some welding oxygen sources are even purer than the other two because they have to have purity for certain kinds of technical welding, like aerospace welding. So it's okay to use medical oxygen on board. It's okay to get your oxygen tanks filled at oxygen supply places or welding stores. The problem is if it's a built-in system, the FAA still requires an A&P to fill the system, and as they're supposed to use aviator oxygen. But that just increases the cost, unfortunately. Oxygen is really very inexpensive. Then moving on to carbon monoxide detectors. Carbon monoxide is the only thing that'll fool a pulse oximeter. Pulse oximeters work on colorimetrics, so it essentially is measuring the redness of your blood, because the higher the oxygenation of your blood, the redder it is. And carbon monoxide, which binds to the hemoglobin molecule in your blood, makes the blood even redder. So that's why it's important to have a pulse oximeter as well as a carbon monoxide detector. Now, carbon monoxide, when we first started selling them at Aeromedics years and years ago, we introduced those to the market like in 1995, I think it was. We thought we'd see a lot of carbon monoxide from firewalls. And it was very interesting because the reports we got weren't from firewalls. And our thinking was that was because the firewalls and the heater muffs get inspected every year. What doesn't get inspected are things like door seals, seals on landing gear, a rear part of the aircraft, because the cockpit of an airplane is generally, because of the Bernoulli effect, has a negative pressure. You can get exhaust sucked in from the tail up into the actual cockpit. And so carbon dioxide detectors are very important. And I'll give you two great examples. One is personal. I flew a biplane to Oshkosh one year. We had a booth there, and I had a front seat passenger who wasn't a pilot who had worked for us. And she's on the way out there, she said, I think I'm getting carbon monoxide poisoning. And I said, we're flying 100 miles an hour at an open cockpit biplane. There's no way you're getting carbon monoxide. Well, she brings the carbon monoxide detector with her on the way back, and she was getting 100 parts per million in the front hole because of the swirl of the exhaust around into her cockpit. I was getting 10 parts per million just 3 feet behind her. So, that was a huge difference. And by just changing the way the exhaust, instead of having it from the side, having it go down, that changed everything. But that was a real lesson for me. The other thing that happened, and this was to a friend who had a mall, I'd given him a carbon monoxide detector because he had given me a ride somewhere, and it was still in the box. And it's in his airplane. He hadn't even taken it out of the box, and it starts going off on a flight, a routine 1-hour flight. And he's going, he can't figure out what's going on. And, it's like, what's happening? And what had happened was he had an inspection panel underneath his seat that came off in flight. And there was no way he was going to know that inspection panel had come off except for the carbon monoxide detector, because now the exhaust was coming right into the aircraft. So it makes a big difference. I do want to point out another point, because you can't just go buy a carbon monoxide detector at Home Depot and call it a day. Because, and this is one of those screwy rules, for home use, these carbon monoxide detectors that are UL approved, Underwriter Laboratory approved, cannot alarm below 35 parts per million. And that's because the fire departments complained because they were getting too many false alarms. So people would call 911 because they had an alarm going off, and it wasn't much carbon monoxide. But in an aircraft, you want a low-level reading, because if it's 7 or if it's 10 or if it's 15 parts per million, you don't need it to make an emergency descent and land. But you may want to do something to say, hey, let's open up the air vents and see if that goes down, or let's lean out the mixture a bit and see if that goes down. Obviously, if the CO level keeps going up, I mean, if it's going up to 25 and 30, 35, well, maybe it's time to get on the ground. But there are a lot of things that can be done in the air that will change things. And even taxiing out, a lot of times people get high levels of carbon monoxide because they got that mixture in full rich. And if they just lean the mixture out for taxi, the carbon monoxide goes away. And lean a peak, of course, if you're flying lean a peak, there's no carbon monoxide at all.
Yeah, I'm a huge supporter of both of those, pulse oximeters and CO detectors. I've had personal experiences with both those. I had a incident in a helicopter with a quarter-size hole in the exhaust that I'm convinced I wouldn't be here if it weren't for a CO detector. So you're preaching to the choir on that, but great tips. So Brent, we always close Pilot's Discretion with a rapid-fire series of questions we call Ready to Copy. I'll throw out some questions on a range of topics, and you read back with your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Okay. All right.
Overall, what grade would you give BasicMed as a policy? A, B, C, D, F?
A.
And what is one thing that could be done to make BasicMed even better?
I think expansion to really eliminate third-class medicals. I do think that it's probably reasonable to require at least one third-class medical, but after that, I think BasicMed should be all that's required. I mean, don't forget, the only major difference between BasicMed and third-class medical is that any physician can do a BasicMed exam. The form and the history form is the same. So it's just who does the exam.
You wrote in a recent AOPA column, quote, "The most important word a patient can say is no," end quote. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that the medical system, once you're in it, will swallow people up and hurt people. And the system is set up for aggressive testing and over-testing and over-diagnosis and over-treatment, for that matter, with medications and sometimes surgical procedures. So it's important to say no. It's important to get a second opinion.
What's the number one cause of problems on the FA medical application? Is it inconsistency between years when I fill it out, lack of detail? You mentioned checking the box earlier on heart attack. What's one thing, if I'm going for a medical next week, I should not do?
Oh, God. That's a tough question, because that entire history form is so screwy. I would think don't check yes for things that are irrelevant. That's the only thing I could really say. Now that when you get down to the exact legality, I mean, we're supposed to, if you read the back of your medical certificate, you're supposed to report any change in medical condition. So if you break your finger legally, you're supposed to report it to the FAA. But, the point is the FAA doesn't want to know about your flu or your colds or things unless there was some significance to it. So don't just check everything on there. I mean, you can't be too literal is what I'm basically saying. Don't be too literal on that stuff. But a couple things, if you've had a DUI or any drug-related issues, you got to make sure you check that, because that can cause you to lose your license just for not reporting it. And I don't mean just your medical, but I'm talking about your license. Because if you have a DUI that's an arrest, and even if it's thrown out of court, if you don't report that arrest, you can actually lose not only your medical, but all your pilot certificates.
If I have a question about my medical history when I'm going for an FA medical, should I call my everyday family doctor or should I call my AME?
Well, there are several resources. You could call your AME if it's a friendly AME. You could call the AOPA. You could call the EAA, has a pilot medical program as well, and ask other pilots. But you can certainly ask AMEs off the record. It doesn't necessarily need to be your AME. You can call other AMEs. But the problem with calling any physician is that a lot of physicians will say, hey, that's not a problem, but it is a problem to the FAA. So if you're not an AME, if the person's not an AME, they may not know what the rules are. And we get this problem all the time, is that, what medicines, for instance, are okay to take. And a lot of docs will say, well, sure, that's easy. That's not a problem. And the FAA say, no, can't do that.
What is one everyday habit that has a surprisingly big health benefit?
I'd say exercise is probably the most significant one.
And do I have to go for a long 5-mile run, or can I just take a little walk?
Well, that depends. And the definition of exercise from a medical perspective is to get your heart rate in the target zone for 30 minutes every day. That's the goal. And the goal heart rate is 220 minus your age, and then 70% of that. And it's a sustained heart rate. So it doesn't make any difference how you get there. So in other words, one day it could be walking briskly. The next day it could be on a Stairmaster. The next day it could be hiking up a hill. But it's a sustained heart rate. So even though tennis, for instance, is a great sport, you stop to serve, so your heart rate drops down. Downhill skiing, you stop to get on the lift, your heart rate drops down. But it's that sustained heart rate. And so going for a leisurely walk with the dogs may not do it. In other words, if you're not breaking out in a sweat, or you can talk in long sentences with somebody you're walking with, you're probably not walking fast enough. And if you're in good shape, you may need to walk uphill if you don't want to run. But it's that sustained heart rate's the real important factor.
You fly a Norseman, an airplane most listeners probably won't recognize in their head when I say that. It sort of looks like a de Havilland Beaver, although I'm sure you'd correct me on that. What is the most unique feature of this airplane?
Well, it's a de Havilland Beaver on steroids is what it is. It's basically, the best way I can describe it is it's like if you've ever flown a 182, it's like if you can imagine a 182 being a pickup truck. And that's what it's like.
And where's the best place to land that in the backcountry? You live out west, you fly around Idaho, Montana, lots of great places. What's a great strip to land a bush plane like that on?
Well, Johnson Creek is a great strip. It's a good long strip. The climb out is always interesting. But, we have grass strip at our airport. But the more you can land on grass, for my preference, the better it is. Certainly makes landings a lot easier as well.
And what's your one tip for a pilot who's getting a tailwheel checkout for the first time? Norseman can be a handful to fly. So from somebody who's flown the big stuff, what should I remember when I get checked out in something like that?
Well, quite honestly, my 185 is much harder to land from a tailwheel perspective than the Norseman. The Norseman is actually much easier. I think probably the most significant thing is when you're getting a checkout, make sure you get into some crosswinds. Because once you get the tailwheel landing down, that isn't really that hard. But what's hard is when you have a crosswind, and you have to really pay attention to that. So you want to, if you go up with an instructor to get that sign off, make sure you try to get some crosswind landings in.
Our last question is always the same on this podcast. You have one final flight, and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Oh, gee. Well, 185 to any place in the backcountry is probably the best.
Brent, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.